Hi everyone, and welcome to the Enthusiastic Buddhist. So at the time of making this video, it's the beginning of January 2014, so Happy New Year to everyone. Now, since this is the time when a lot of us might be thinking about making New Year's resolutions, I thought it would be good to do a talk on practicing the 4 great efforts, because in effect these are like 4 resolutions in themselves. As you might recall from my previous video on the Noble Eightfold Path, there are 8 things we need to train in if we want to develop a mind that's like the Buddha's, and one of these 8 is practicing right effort. So right effort can be broken down into 4 trainings, and these are the effort to prevent negative mental states from arising in our mind. So we train in preventing states such as anger, jealousy, greed or pride from arising in our mind. The effort to abandon any negative state of mind that has arisen. So if any of these or other negative states arise in our mind, we do our best to use the antidotes to eliminate them. The effort to cultivate positive mental states not yet arisen. This means we try to cultivate wholesome states of mind such as compassion, wisdom, generosity, if we're not already experiencing them. And the effort to maintain these wholesome states of mind that have arisen. So whenever we notice that these positive mental states have arisen in our mind, we make the effort to prolong them. Now, as you know, when we make New Year's resolutions or set goals for ourselves for the new year, we're often looking at a long-term goal, which we hope to achieve within the year. And for a lot of us, our New Year's goals are often focused on changing something about our outer appearance, like improving our body image, so to lose weight or perhaps change our diet, or our goal might be focused on completing a degree or some other project. Now, although there's nothing necessarily wrong with these goals, the problem is that our perceived happiness and success is reliant on some external change in our outer environment. But the Buddha always advised that the path to happiness was to be found within, not without. So if we're really serious about setting some goals to achieve happiness this year, then we should look at working on our inner environment of our own minds. And more precisely, we need to train our minds to avoid negative mental states and to dwell more often in positive mental states. So we don't need to wait to the end of the year or for when our goal is finally achieved to be happy. We can actually find happiness today just by practicing these 4 great efforts. Now, some of us may have reassessed the past year and looked at what we could have done differently, and maybe we've made some resolutions based on changing our behaviour for the better. So like resolving to practice more patience or become a nicer person. This is definitely a step in the right direction, but unfortunately many of us tend to make quite vague resolutions. For instance, we might resolve to become kinder or to get angry less often, but the problem is that our minds tend to be a bit lazy and we often stop focusing on the resolution after we've made it. It's almost like we think that by making the resolution, half the work is done for us and we can just reassess at the end of the year to see whether we're kinder or less angry than the year before. The other problem that often arises is that we might be full of good intention in the beginning, but if we take a couple of blows and let's say we lose our temper, then we might find that we just lose all our determination because we start thinking that it's just all too hard to change. And then we fall back into our old patterns and habituated ways of doing things. The Buddha never spoke on New Year's resolutions because he advocated the need for us to make daily effort and resolutions. In fact, not even daily resolutions, but you could say moment-to-moment resolutions. Our effort needs to be constant and continuous, and every moment we should be trying to remove what is negative mental states and to cultivate what are positive mental states. It might sound like a lot of work, but it isn't actually as hard as it might seem. We just need to practice some self-awareness of our behaviour and especially of our thoughts. And it's a bit like steering a boat. We just need to learn how to steer our minds in a positive direction. So this is why practicing the 4 great efforts will lead to much greater success in achieving the goal of becoming a better and happier person, because it focuses our attention on making incremental changes in our thoughts, which will ultimately lead to an overhaul of our personality, habits and way of being in the world. So what I want to do in this video is go through the 4 great efforts and talk about ways we can incorporate them into our life and maintain their practice so that we can start to see real change in our lives right now and real happiness. These practices really have the power to transform our mind. Change happens slowly, day by day, and we can choose whether we have a successful year and find greater happiness by the end of it or not by simply choosing what we allow into our minds right now. Now, usually our minds are filled with one of these 3 kinds of thoughts. They are either negative and unwholesome, positive and wholesome, or neutral, which are neither negative nor positive. So when we employ these 4 great efforts, it's really a matter of weeding out what is unwholesome and planting and cultivating what is positive and wholesome so that our mind is filled with positive, wholesome mental factors, which will only lead to greater peace and happiness in our minds now and in the future. And the more we fill our minds with thoughts with kindness, love and compassion, it won't be long before our mind is overflowing with positivity. Then who cares if we lose that extra 5 or 10 kilos or not this year, because now we're happy, which was really our ultimate goal all along anyway. In his teachings, the Buddha gave a lovely analogy of a water pot being filled drop by drop as an example of how we acquire positive and negative karma. His analogy also explains how, like a water pot, our minds can be filled with either negative or positive mental factors. He said, "Think not lightly of evil, saying it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise, the fool, gathering it little by little, fills himself with evil. Think not lightly of good, saying it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise, the wise man, gathering it little by little, fills himself with good." So we can choose what to fill our minds with when we practice the 4 great efforts. And the first practice is that we must exert effort toward preventing negative mental states from arising in our mind. As I mentioned, these negative states of mind include anger, jealousy, greed, pride, and ignorance. Sometimes they're translated as evil or unskillful mental qualities, and the reason is because these states of mind cause pain to ourselves as well as others. When we allow these mental states to remain in our mind, they don't give us any peace. In fact, states like anger, greed and jealousy are obviously toxic, and we usually don't even feel comfortable in our own skin when we're experiencing these emotions. So they don't allow us to feel good now, and they often only lead to negative and unwholesome behaviour, which again only harms ourselves as well as others. As the Buddha said, "Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought. If with an impure mind a person speaks or acts, suffering follows him like the wheel that follows the foot of the ox. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought. If with a pure mind a person speaks or acts, happiness follows him like his never-departing shadow." So we should be doing everything in our power to avoid negative or unskillful thoughts from arising in our mind, because the speech and behaviour that springs from these thoughts can only bring further suffering now and in the future. So part of the practice of preventing negative states of mind from arising is to practice mindfulness. We need to have the awareness of being able to see our thoughts as they arise, and this awareness is primarily cultivated through meditation. So if we don't yet have a regular meditation practice, it's something we really need to consider adopting straight away. Even 10 minutes a day will make a difference. Now, to prevent negative thoughts from arising, we'll also need to have the wisdom to know if they're negative and unskillful, as well as to know what the appropriate antidote is to apply to each negative state of mind. For example, generating compassion is an antidote to preventing anger from arising. And another part of this practice has to do with what we expose ourselves to. For instance, what company we keep and what activities we engage in. I think we can all see from our own experience that who we spend our time with can play a big part on whether our mind develops wholesome habits or not. I mean, if we spend our time socialising with people who aren't interested in developing their minds and only engage in gossip or drinking, then we're not likely to develop much wisdom in their company. It might seem an enjoyable way to pass the time, but it ultimately doesn't benefit us very much and can cause us to engage in unwholesome or negative thoughts ourselves. Now, if we notice that we're experiencing a negative mental state, we sometimes have the tendency to think, oh, well, it's only a minor thought, it really doesn't matter. But to borrow the analogy of the cart and ox, every time the wheels of the cart run over the grooves in the ground, it makes deeper indentations and carves a path for other wheels to follow. And in the same way, every time we experience the same mental state, we create a karmic propensity for our minds to habitually recreate those thoughts again in the future. And karma has the quality of increasing with time, so the greater the habit, the more intense the negative mental state will be each time it arises. So this is one of the reasons why we avoid killing animals and even insects in Buddhism, because we want to prevent our minds from habituating the thought and intent to kill or harm others. Because one day, if we continuously disregard life, we might be able to kill other humans and perhaps even someone from our own family. So we have to be careful about what mental habits we're carving into our mind and not ignore some negative thought thinking that it's too minor to be worried about. It could help to think of our minds like a delicious meal that we're trying to make. And if we add too much salt or unpleasant things to the meal, we're not going to have something enjoyable or palatable once we're finished. Or alternatively, you could think of the mind as being like a house that we have to live in. If we clutter it with too many negative things, we won't have something that's either spacious or pleasant to abide in now or in the future. Now, it might happen that a negative thought arises in our mind and we know it's there and we're actually enjoying it to some extent. We're not in a hurry to let it go. For instance, we might be having a fantasy about our friend's partner or something like that. And we know it's wrong, but it seems harmless, right? No one knows what we're thinking, so what's the harm in indulging a little bit? Well, irrespective of the negative state of mind that arises, whether we engage in it privately or not, it's still going to be harmful. The analogy used is that it's like drinking poison. Whether we drink poison in private or out in the open, the result is going to be the same. It's going to harm us greatly. Actually, there's nothing that we can ever do that is private, because it's said that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas know our minds since they've reached the stage of omniscience, or at least have some extrasensory abilities. So they're like a person who can see standing in front of a blind man. They can see everything without veils. So we should really ask ourselves, if we know others are aware of what we're thinking, would we still do it? Once we've developed a good degree of mindfulness, our mindfulness will actually help act like an inner policeman for us. I mean, when we're driving around and we notice a police car behind us, we suddenly become the best driver on the road, don't we? We use our indicators a lot, we drive to the speed limit, and we check our mirrors. In the same way, when we have mindfulness, it'll keep our mind on the straight and narrow so that we don't allow what's negative and unwholesome to arise in our minds. So some practical tips for preventing negative mental states from arising in our minds are to practice mindfulness, which is cultivated by meditation. So this way we can see the negative states as they begin to arise. Learn the antidotes to negative states so that we can employ them as soon as we notice the negative state arising. Keep good company. Avoid anything known to cause negative states of mind. For instance, if we know certain movies affect us in a certain way, such as violent movies make us more aggressive, then we should avoid them. Guard ourselves when we meet with known difficult people. So if we have people in our lives that often make us angry, then before we meet with them, we should armour ourselves with extra tolerance, because we know to expect this difficulty. Don't allow ourselves to believe all the thoughts that come into our mind. So just because a negative thought has arisen in our mind, we don't have to feed it with more negative thoughts and give it the power to stay. Try to see our thought as nothing more than a thought. You can use the technique I taught in a previous video on meditation, where we mentally repeat thinking, so that we don't let ourselves get carried away, which can lead to more negative thoughts and negative behaviour. Recite confessional prayers. When we confess our negative thoughts and promise not to engage in them again, it creates greater mindfulness in us to avoid them in the future. Reflect on the day before sleeping and make a vow not to engage in negative thoughts again. So just before we sleep at night, we should quickly review our day and identify the negative thoughts we indulged in and resolve not to repeat them again the next day. So these are some practical tips for preventing negative states from arising in our mind. Now, the second training in the 4 great efforts is to abandon any negative states of mind that have arisen. So if we succeeded in the first one, we won't need to do this one, but unfortunately for most of us, we don't notice the negative mental states as they're arising. Instead, it's only once they start to impede on our happiness and our normal functioning that we realise that, oh, I'm angry. So how do we combat these negative states of mind once they've taken hold of us? Some practical tips are to meditate and let it go. Now, when I was 19, I went on my first Buddhist pilgrimage to the holy sites in India. And one of the things I learnt from that trip was the Buddhist idea of non-killing, especially of insects. Then, when I got back to Australia, I went on a camping trip with some friends to the coast. And I was telling one of my friends about this idea of non-killing while he was playing with an insect. At first, my friend was saying, oh, what a nice idea. And then in the next instance, he intentionally killed the insect with his thumb and said, oh, poor insect. Anyway, my reaction really surprised me. Before I knew it, I was fuming with anger and chastising my friend. I then went to get into my car to drive away, and my friend followed me and got in the car as well because he was a bit worried about my reaction because it was so out of character for me. And then I drove quite angrily through the streets to the beach, which obviously is not a good thing, with my friend just sitting next to me looking at me in astonishment. Then when I got to the beach, I got out of the car, I walked over to a rock, sat down and started to meditate. And I was just practicing concentrating on my breath. I don't know how long I sat there for, perhaps 15 minutes in total, but by the end of it, I felt like a totally different person. My anger had 100% totally disappeared. I was completely calm and my mind was serene. My friend who'd been sitting behind me and watching me while I meditated couldn't believe the transformation after my meditation. He told me his belief in the power of meditation was ignited from this one event after seeing the change in me. And I myself have witnessed time and time again the power of meditation and its ability to help us let go of negative mental states. Now, some other tips to combating negative mental states are to apply the appropriate antidote. This is something I mentioned that we have to do when we notice negative thoughts arising, but it's also something we have to continue to do when negative states are still present in our mind. So I'll just briefly go over some of the main antidotes to combat negative states of mind, as I plan to go over these in more detail in future videos when discussing each of the negative mental states. So the antidote to jealousy is to practice gratitude, contentment, and to rejoice in others' happiness. We need to recognise that we have so many wonderful things that the other person doesn't have, and that we're actually really very fortunate. I'll be doing a video on jealousy soon, so stay tuned for that one. The antidote to anger is compassion, understanding, and wisdom. We need to realise that others only hurt us because they're overwhelmed by their own defilements and negative states of mind. Maybe they're stressed. If someone has hurt us and we feel angry, it's a sure sign that the other person has fallen under the power of the afflictions themselves. So they should really be an object of our compassion and forgiveness. The antidote to craving is contentment and wisdom. We need to try and be content in the present moment because the future isn't certain. There's little benefit in obsessing about something that we might never obtain. And if we're craving for someone or something, we should try to bring to mind something negative about it or about them to try and regain some sense of balance so that our minds are not blowing out all the desirable qualities out of proportion. Now, the third practice of the 4 great efforts is the effort to cultivate positive mental states not yet arisen. Not only does it make us feel happy to cultivate wholesome states of mind such as compassion, wisdom, generosity, joy in others' success, and gratitude, but developing these positive mental states develops positive karmic propensities which will create good karma and lead to favourable results for us now and in the future. The problem is we tend to be a bit lazy about generating positive mental states. Often we need an external motivator. So like if we see someone who's in need, then we practice compassion and generosity. But we need to learn to give rise to these positive feelings, whether there's an external stimulant or not. One way is to do specific meditations on cultivating positive mental qualities, like doing meditations on loving kindness and compassion. Another practice is to practice changing neutral thoughts into positive ones. So whatever mundane activity we're currently doing, we create a positive wish that's similar to the exercise. So if we're driving, we could wish, may all beings travel towards enlightenment. Or if we're showering, may all beings rinse their minds of negative thoughts. This way we create powerful positive thoughts that wouldn't have otherwise been cultivated. In terms of cultivating a positive state, if we're having an argument with someone, we can arouse forgiveness and compassion by reflecting on the all-pervasive suffering in the world. I mean, when we're fighting with someone, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many people who are fighting with others in the world that are fights that are even worse than ours. So we should recognise that where there is smoke, there is fire. Our little dispute is only evidence of the greater suffering in the world. So when we think like this, it arouses greater compassion and forgiveness in our minds. And it can be helpful to remember that we and the other person are both subject to death. So we're both objects of compassion. Life is too short to hold grudges, and we should practice forgiveness because no one is perfect. And then we can increase our positive mental state by doing something kind for them. And if they don't respond kindly to us, then we should see them as a great spiritual teacher who's there to teach us to practice tolerance, patience, and wisdom. And the last suggestion I want to make on the third effort for cultivating positive mental states is that if we know we're weak in some areas, then we should deliberately target it. It's a bit like how we try to build our physical muscles. We try to increase the habits in our mind by deliberately working on them. For instance, if we lack devotion, we could try generating it, even if it is contrived at first. Or if we're not very generous, then try to practice generosity 6 times each day with small actions, like making tea for others or letting other people go in front of us in the queue or in traffic. And the last of the 4 great efforts is the effort to maintain these wholesome states of mind that have arisen. So we try to prolong virtuous states of mind such as compassion and tolerance. One way to increase their duration is that if we notice we're feeling compassion because we saw something on the news, let's say, then think of more objects of compassion to strengthen and prolong this feeling. We can start thinking of others who are also suffering in the world from all sorts of unfortunate circumstances. And to help motivate us to prolong these positive states of mind, it can be helpful to reflect on the law of karma, knowing that the positive thoughts and actions lead to favourable results and happiness. So we can rejoice in knowing that the virtue we're creating now will lead to positive experiences. So we therefore should feel enthused to continue engaging in them. So as we practice these 4 great efforts and remove the negative states of mind and replace them with positive ones, we'll notice how much happier we can become. There are many great benefits that come from practicing the 4 great efforts. We shouldn't think of them as being great because they're big and difficult to achieve, but great in the benefits that we gain from practicing them. Some of these benefits are that we'll feel more confident and in control of our lives and our feelings, and it also makes our day more meaningful. If there was ever something worth putting our continuous effort towards, it's the development of our mind to become like the Buddhas. So don't feel like that we have to make any one particular resolution for the year. Instead, let's focus our attention on working with our minds in this moment, trying to remove and prevent the negative and cultivate and prolong the positive. And don't be discouraged if you don't always succeed. Just recognise where we have room to improve, forgive ourselves, and try to do better the next time. Just try to make a little progress on each of the 4 efforts every day, and congratulate yourself every day for any small progress you've made. Don't wait to the end of the year to give ourselves a pat on the back, okay? So that's all from me from this video. I think I'll soon be doing the exercise on combating jealousy because I've mentioned that a couple of times in my videos now. So please subscribe to my channel for future videos. Please like and share this video if you found it helpful. Leave me a comment below, and if you want to read and watch more about Buddhism and meditation, you can check it all out on my website, enthusiasticbuddhist.com. So have a great week everyone, and I hope to see you in the next episode.